Welcome to the Oxford Global Society podcast with me, Brian Wong, an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong and a fellow at the Society. Professor Stefan Dercon is a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and a director of the Centre for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. He's also served as a leading policy advisor to the UK government and most notably as the Chief Economist of the Department of International Development between 2011 and 2017, and as a senior advisor to successive foreign secretaries between 2020 and 2022. Stefan is also an incredible teacher and supervisor, I've been told, and also witnessed myself, having seen a long queues of students outside his office. He's a warm and deeply instructive educator for many leaders, policymakers, and thinkers. Stefan, it's an honor to have you with us today.
Oh, Brian, thank you. What an introduction, but thank you.
You're most welcome. So I want to just start with your excellent latest gambling on development, while some countries win and others lose. And Stefan, I take it that your central thesis, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is as follows. Whether a country successfully develops economically turns hugely on the decisions undertaken by its elite. More specifically, in basing the claim of legitimacy upon the economic performance of the state, in responding to empirics and evidence on the ground whilst addressing errors and course correcting, and finally, in staking out a spirit of adventurism and open-mindedness through technocratic advisors who are well-informed and well-trained. Is this a fair characterization of your central claim? And how does it sit with the titular question of our series, which is, does democracy lead to better development? Over to you, Stefan.
Well, first, so two things, but of course they're totally linked together to your second question on democracy and on the general thesis. I think, the way I like to think about it is that every society, and I mean every society, whatever the political system, in the end, George Orwell was right. Some are more equal than others. Some have more influence, some have more power. And I don't want to look simply at a political class. It's often interwoven with the military class, with senior civil servants, actually with intellectuals, with the storytellers of societies, with journalists, with media people, with religious leaders, all these kind of things. Some kind of a group of people brought in a little bit nebulous in terms of exactly who's really in it or whatever. I can't give you an exact number who they're in it, but these are the people that somehow or another have an implicit deal with each other. Not always with everybody included. It's usually a dominant coalition that somehow sets the tone. That sets the tone and the direction. And then you're correct in saying, look, how does growth and development come about is when that implicit deal that they have with each other somehow put performance around the economy and around some form of inclusiveness quite central in their legitimacy, in their way they want to be assessed and evaluated. Okay, so it does mean that you could get across quite different political systems this kind of aspect to be present. Now, what does it say about democracy versus other ways of organizing government? It's that, it's a very striking thing. Empirical evidence tells us, definitely when it comes to growth per capita, the per capita growth performance of countries. On average, if we go back into data to even 1800, where we begin to have data in a lot of places, or we do look at it at the data set maybe starting in 1960, 70, 1980, you get this very strange result that on average, democracies and autocracies, at least when defined by some kind of indicators like the polity data set, on average, they perform similarly well. The per capita growth performance is not that different. The real interesting thing is that the variance amongst autocracies is larger. And of course, you can see what democracy does. It has an error correction in it that it probably stops you from extreme performances. There's always a kind of a correction. It's another form of an external accountability or correction. And in autocracy means that, given that growth and development are typically very long-term things, if you have an autocracy, well, you could potentially be on the positive side. And so some of the best performers are autocracies in these periods. Some of the worst ones as well, because there's no correction mechanism. And so you get it's more an issue of the variance of the spread than actually about the mean. So what does it mean? Well, that you have plenty of democracies who don't perform very well in these matters, because actually, if I go to, in my book as well, I go to Malawi, I go to Sierra Leone, there's election processes taking place. And not about whether they were well or not well done. In Malawi, elections actually are, reasonably done. But whoever is in power, it doesn't seem to make much difference because actually the elite is such that the capture is such that the performance is not there. I'm going to Pakistan quite a lot, and of course a complicated place where the military plays a particular role, but I'm actually spending a lot of time these days working on Pakistan. But you do have over periods of time democracy functioning well, but doesn't deliver you really anything on the economy. And there's no relationship there between whether it's military or the democracy part. Again, it's a lot of elite capture, vested interest, and somehow or another that's not on the agenda. So for me, the kind of development is not simply about political system. It's not even about simply economic system because there's no purity in economic systems. In fact, pragmatism, as you were alluding to, is a central feature of success. And so in that sense, it is much more to do with the underlying elite commitment. Are they actually fundamentally willing to have growth and development as part of the way they will be assessed, evaluated, the source of their legitimacy or not? And I maybe should the final thing that always comes out is, why don't they all do it? If it's the elite that can grow the pie, why don't they all do it? Now, it's a lot to do with how you think about your power. And one of the things that elites have is the power of the status quo. They know the system, they know where they are, and they can keep control. And I look at Nigeria. There I say I look at, lots of countries. Look at China pre-1979. It was not around democratic development progress that it was assessed. It was something else. And power was organized around the status quo. And in Nigeria, it's status quo about oil distribution. And why should you as an elite gamble on that progress? Because it is quite a tricky thing to reshape your coalition of power to actually go for something else. And growth is a disruptor. Every society, growth and development are disruptors. They change elites. They get new people that want to be part of it and so on. So they don't do it all.
That answer, there's so much to unpack there, but I just want to home in on the final point you were making there concerning, the status quo or tendency to see the status quo as a risk-averse option. And that ties me on to a broader question I had when reading your work in your book is, you paint a very compelling picture about the importance and centrality of elite choices and decisions. But one critique that one might launch is that, well, what really is driving those elite choices and decisions, right? It's almost like a bit of a black box there. And I suppose one element you gestured towards is the idea of the status quo. CF the classic line, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So in the case of China, obviously, between 1966 and 1976, something was deeply, deeply broken about that system, which then paved the way for, first of all, Hua Guofeng's attempted sluggish reforms. He was too slow, and then he was outpaced and outmatched by Deng Xiaoping. Or alternatively, again, Suharto, the new order worked until it didn't in the 1990s. And of course, he had to make way for the quote unquote democratic, successors to his rule. And the same could be said of, I guess, Park Chung-hee's rule to some extent in South Korea under the authoritarian period and a military junta. So my question for you, Stefan, is, I know it's very hard to generalize and just extrapolate patterns and trends from all of these disparate examples. But if I were to ask you to explain these elite decisions, what are the possible variables that you'd reach for? Is it the upbringing? Is it the nature of the occupations? Are they military leaders? Or are they political leaders? Are they personalistic dictators versus, ideologues? Like, what exactly are the explanatory variables you'd say are useful here for us to think about?
Yes. So at the risk of just, as you were already implying, generalizing a lot of different contexts, and it's putting language on something that more to do with the experience I have of who I meet and what they're trying to do rather than, a quantitative data set. I would say it's actually, coalitions need brokers. And it's people that actually have the ability to find a way of bringing these coalitions together. Power is rarely about one person having it all. Even autocratic leaders need to have a coalition that keeps them in power. And I think it's a lot to do with brokerage. I was very struck by political scientists once telling me, not because I asked, but I was asking questions about Singapore and said, Lee Kuan Yew was an amazing broker. And I thought, oh, that's actually really captured it. I saw that actually in some senses in some of the African countries where Meles Zenawi, yes, the success not being able to continue, but for 15, 20 years, really getting a lot of the economic growth going, it needed for him quite a lot of time already being in power to actually broker that he would be strong enough that people would come along. And I think there's an element of that that the key feature is there. The other side to it is why would there be a condition to actually being able to broker a different type of coalition of power that actually is growth oriented? And I do think it's to do with legitimacy. It's legitimacy crisis. One way or another, even typical, what some people call process legitimacy, the form of legitimacy, the constitutional right and whatever, at some point it gets under pressure. There is something performative about it. There is something about the intrinsic legitimacy that, no, I'm actually delivering, and that actually creates the pressures, which actually then links back to it, often crisis. It's not so much that they are military leaders, but maybe they are there in a crisis. There's plenty of military leaders have wasted crisis and coming to power. But actually, there are some that actually, because they are there during these moments, that actually can do it. So I think it is the variables seem to be somehow there. Are these people good brokers? Do they take advantage of a window of opportunity? And actually, a crisis of legitimacy seems to be very much, at least with the cases I was looking at, very much a common feature that at some point, maybe it's the fear of losing power, the fear of pressure, and actually the fear of losing power is a good motivator for elite players to actually step aside.
I want to take a look at this crisis thesis that you're raising here. Perhaps we can apply this to Ethiopia and contrast the leaderships of Zenawi and Abiy Ahmed, and what's going on right now. Because obviously, when you penned a book, I guess the unfolding situation with regards to the ethnic strife, Tigray, secessionist movement and liberation movement, it was still very murky, and whereas now we have a sort of tenuous peace that's been achieved there. To what extent do you think Abiy Ahmed lacks what Zenawi had in terms of, as you said, brokering that modus vivendi between these disparate ethnic groups? Was it really more about luck and also the catch-up growth that Ethiopia could make back then versus the sort of difficulty of its pushing through further growth today that contributed towards the relative stability under Zenawi's rule before his untimely departure?
Oh, yes. So it brings back memories of how I kept on having to write that chapter because always stuff was happening in Ethiopia while I was actually writing it. So I was writing into 2020, and I was managing to correct it again, the proof, so to speak, when the conflict already between Tigray and then the federal government, essentially Abiy Ahmed, had broken out. So first of all, I cannot just but comment on, now I understand why political scientists always stop 10 years before the current date, because, it's a nightmare to try to be up to date because, situations unfold. But I think what I was beginning to argue in the book, and I would argue more forcefully, is actually the following. The way in every society, I want to strongly make that link. What is that elite deal that is there? There's many features to it, but there's definitely always a political and an economic aspect to it. The kind of the economic direction that I want to see because of growth and development as a source of legitimacy, but there is always a political dimension that goes a bit beyond that. And of course, the reality in Ethiopia is that the political deal has to, be respectful, call it of history, respectful of history in the sense of, Christopher Clapham, the political scientist working on, or historian writing on a lot about the Horn, he always says like the national question was never resolved in Ethiopia, the Rosa Luxemburg thing. And it's that kind of thing that the national question has to be resolved at the same time. So what Meles Zenawi did, it was looking for the economic route to get full legitimacy for the political deal he had forged. But the political deal was essentially enforced, was essentially a military enforced political deal. And he actually never managed despite the constitutional thing, the federal thing. Look, the TPLF, the Tigrayan group that was Meles came from, that was the leading part of the coalition, their source of power was not legitimacy through political means, it was legitimacy through military means. You know, they are most powerful despite representing only 5-6% of the population. It's because they had brokered the political deal by military means. And I think what's really interesting, and that makes this difference between some other parts of the world, is that you're working in a multi-ethnic society, you'll have to find a way of making sure that that political deal also sticks. What Meles Zenawi tried to do, I don't need to do the politics. I'm going to get full legitimacy, including politically, through economic development. And actually, somewhere or another, he forgot about politics. And somehow he actually never managed to reshape the deal. Of course, people would say he was smart enough to actually having recognized that. And there's actually still lots of people that tell me if he had lived longer, you know, he passed away, that actually the successor government didn't really have the kind of intellectual or pragmatic lead of Meles Zenawi and couldn't quite do the deal. And so in a sense, what happened in Ethiopia is that just going for legitimacy through economic and developmental means just didn't work. You need to have the political backing as well. If I may, so Abiy Ahmed, he then thought, well, I just have political legitimacy, and arguably coming from the majority group, he did everything that a lot of people had asked for, releasing every political prisoner, doing all the thing, calling elections and so on. And, you know, arguably, generally, he had majority support behind it. But in a funny sort of way, he then created a condition that the political deal wasn't really done either, because it is multi-ethnic. It's an elite deal between the multiple groups, and it fell apart. And then once Humpty Dumpty has fallen, broken down, you know, it's fallen, it can't be put together again. And we're sitting there in this kind of back to stage one. Economics and development can't create a legitimacy in its own. Meanwhile, the politics has been so fragmented, the elite politics, because it's not about really the people. It's elite politics. There is no political deal either at the moment. Yeah.
And just to go back to the, you know, what you said about the political deal that he failed to or didn't necessarily provide robustly, you know, to what extent do you see that deal as, and that's where we go back to the question again of democracy, right? As one that's ultimately revolving around more democratization, more liberalization. I mean, I see two views about this. One view is that, you know, democratization in terms of substantive democratization, it's not just in name, but also in form, in terms of rights and enshrinement of rights, recognition of, you know, electoral rights, equal enfranchisement, all of that. Some might say it would have been necessary but insufficient in the context of Ethiopia because of the sort of ethnic fragmentation and the splintering and heterogeneity. Whereas others would say, you know, it's neither necessary nor sufficient. That maybe the best solution to the question of the nation, the sort of Rosa Luxemburg question, is to have a top-down centralized leadership with power sharing arrangements independent of or sidestepping the people. Now, I'm not saying either of these proposals is particularly, you know, what I would endorse, but I was just wondering, you know, just to push the argument concerning democratization and democracy further, is it a case that a healthy democratic deal is necessary but insufficient for the political bargain or the political deal that you highlighted there? Or is it that actually the political deal you envisioned, Stefan, has very little to do with, you know, substantive democratization?
So the way I would look at it, is a variation of some of the points you made here. I think it's actually the following: is that, you know, and I will say that some of the international partners, including, you know, the government I was working with in the UK, find it sometimes hard to fully understand that. I come from Belgium, a small multi-ethnic country. We have 9 prime ministers. There was democracy before we had 9 prime ministers, but 9 prime ministers was necessary. Basically, regional governments organized by language, by thing. That's ultimately an elite deal. That's not a simple democratic deal. That's also a form of, it's more than just rights. It's actually getting structures that can begin to work. And I'm not saying Belgium works. That's not necessarily the statement I'm going to make, but it works quite well. And it actually provides us a sufficient thing. So it's more than democracy. It introduces things like, you know, yes, you can't simply do majority. So it moves away from democracy as majority rule, democracy as just winning. It basically builds in structures that rights are recognized, but also that you have functional structures where elite players can function. If I go to Kenya, I kind of make the argument somewhat slightly flippantly, and it's a really interesting thing, of course, what's happening now, but and that's a different discussion. What's today happening when we're recording, when there is violence on the streets of Nairobi. But if we go back to previous periods of violence, they were strongly ethnically based. And actually get constitutional reform within a democracy. Yeah, I'm saying did it work or not, but basically, the democracy was never delivering a Luo president because the other ethnic groups could make a coalition to get someone else in power. And so a Luo president from the ethnic group in the west of the country is unlikely. But actually the kind of federal structure or the decentralization they had was a necessary, call it elite deal, to actually more or less saying you don't have to capture State House in Nairobi. You can actually still be, as the family Odinga, in charge of a state, because you are clearly the elite player that has a lot of power and can mobilize people behind you to actually do it. So I'm beginning more to think, you need to find a deal that works further. So it's not naive in some simplistic way that, let's say, non-political scientists will often understand democracy. It's actually looking for structures. And I see this more as a form of accountability. Elite players, like Joe Trowell has alluded to, elite players want a little bit more equality for themselves. They want a little bit more power and influence, and they want to be able to play in a space. And I think in Ethiopia, we need to be able to go to structures where there is definitely general federalization or regionalization, that there is powers there. And it's clearly what the deal would look like. The problem is in a hugely centralized, historically centralized top-down state that never has managed to do it, finding the coalition that actually finds the way, the terms of what that decentralization should look like, what it means politically and not just fiscally and developmental, is clearly the hardest choice, to find a dominant coalition around it. At the same time, for the things I'm interested in, and that's the final point I want to make, the role of democracy here is a form of external accountability. It's a form of checks and balance to avoid in very imperfect states that somehow can't get a top-down, fully motivated, fully committed set of elite players, say, work for development and for growth, to have some accountability structures on it. So I don't use in my writing often the word democracy much. I talk about accountability for economic matters. This idea that people go and vote and so on, is a good way of minimize the risk of the excesses, the extreme excesses that you have there. Malawi would be even worse off, I think, with a kind of patronage-based system, if it didn't have at least every 4 years there was a clean out. 60, I think something like 60-70% of MPs get kicked out of office. Kind of, it's a clean out. You had your 4 years to steal, but now we're kicking you out. Yes, we can't be
better than Westminster in terms of turnover.
Yes, exactly. So it becomes somehow a form of accountability, because unlike some, say, East Asian countries where you have histories of relative meritocratic civil servants, relatively strong structures of delivery, if you don't have them, then I like my democracy as a kind of a checks and balances. By the way, Ethiopia never had any of these. At most, it had a centralized system of delivery. So I was sympathetic to the Mellers agenda in the sense of doing very top-down on the developmental side. And they did amazing, successful things. They had a fairly meritocratic civil service, actually. There's never been a very corrupt civil service there in Ethiopia until maybe in the last few years only. And so you had this. But I do wish that they had worked harder. The politics is the failure there, the ability to do the deal between competing groups and bringing them in the tent.
A core tenet of my research as well, Stefan, it revolves around essentially authoritarian states and the mechanisms of internal accountability within successful examples of them. So I'm with you, and I wholeheartedly, see your approach as not just offering a new, but also a very, I would say, a far more nuanced and less sort of ideologically predisposed and disingenuous approach to development economics. But on that note, I'm sure you get this criticism a lot from some of your challenges or critics, and that is the people. And that's to say, your analysis is very comprehensive when it comes to the choices made by pragmatic political leaders, responsive and accountable bureaucrats, and also folks who are able to influence and shape that central bargain that lies at the core of the enduring stability of governments, democratic or non-democratic. But I was just wondering, beyond sort of providing the external accountability, as with the case of Malawi that you talked about just then, or I suppose in the case of Kenya right now, folks who are protesting are being labeled traitors by by William Ruto. He's calling them traitors over the resentment and a backlash towards the tax hikes. Not casting any judgments there, but I was just wondering, where do you see the people as fitting into your story? Is it just an indirect role that their preferences will comprise a part of what the elite care about and therefore they matter? Or is there a possibility that the grassroots, the hoi polloi, the ordinary citizen, living in a shanty town, for instance, on the outskirts of Manila, is able to influence and shape policy on the ground?
So, okay. I'm going to give a slightly roundabout answer. We all have our audiences, okay, and we all have our backgrounds. I come, of course, shouldn't underestimate, I come very much out of the development economic space, but of course from the aid community. And I have an audience there that is incredibly naive about we the people, UN organizations, World Bank, we the people. We are with the people, we're not with the governments. And I'm actually just having worked in practice, including in a foreign ministry of a country. The countries exist. So let's at least say countries exist. So let's not have naivety and try to first start from the structures of these countries, the structures. Okay, and this is why I keep on, why I even when I do my talks and say, look, working in the front office of a foreign secretary in the UK government during COVID, say, look, where are the people? The people are not on the WhatsApps, the WhatsApp that do all the policy making. They are not there. There's a selective group who has the WhatsApp number, there is should be careful now saying it, but there's a particular prime minister in another country, in a developing country, that seems to sending me WhatsApps every day. I'm the WhatsApp group now as well, and I have considerably more power than several of the citizens in that country at the moment. So I'm an elite player, and that's why I play around with that concept of the elite. There's a group of people who's just so much more connected in there. Yeah. So yes, I have it about an indirect role. I'm not saying that they're therefore irrelevant, but we should just not start from behaving as if it's all everywhere in the world, as if these structures don't exist. Now, where do they fit in? And a lot of people ask me also, what can civil society organizations do? I was listening into a call in on Twitter of some of the activists in Kenya and just listening their language. They're on the street. That's the street. I remember dealing with the street in Sudan when they're trying to push out al-Bashir. And of course, we know Arab Spring, the street was there, and these are the people, these are pushing. And what they can do is exploit crisis of legitimacy. They can exploit and they can put pressure. In the end, though, and I've learned, unfortunately, a lot the bad way, working inside the development community during the Arab Spring, even then the capture will happen. Either the capture from the street, the capture from other groups, and so on. So the people are there, but unfortunately, they have a little bit less power than sometimes people want to offer them. Okay? And so my advice typically is, where do the people fit into it? Is that you have to be the ones that try to question the legitimacy of what exists within your system, And let's not talk here about authoritarian systems, but even kind of supposedly democratic systems like in Nigeria. I'm afraid it's really hard to actually get any of that pressure. But we know in Kenya, as we see today, there's a history of actually activists being able to hold governments to account. We see it even in the election. In fact, Mr. Ruto, came on the back of actually people wanting to break to some extent ethnic politics and actually voting for people based on performance or at least on ambition. And, the Oxford-educated economic advisor, David N.D., who was our student in Oxford, he is the main advisor of Ruto. And, yes, he made a mess of it in his advice to Ruto on it. But, he comes also actually out of an activist life. So, yeah, the people are there, and it's about the legitimacy. But Why I play them down a bit is that I hear too much naivety about it.
Yeah.
As if where we started, as if democracy is enough. No, people vote all these people in. That's not a thing. It's about the accountability of these people, and then there are limited things, limited, or indeed some of the aid community just saying, I do not like it when I hear a vice president in the World Bank telling me, yes, we know that government is no good, but we are just there for the people, and that's what we all do. No, you're there with the government. Your entire legitimacy as the World Bank being there is because you work with the government, and you just be there a little bit. Do I believe revolutions would be possible and real grassroots movements? Well, they can provide the pressure. I'm old enough to be more worried about the violent uprisings.
Yeah.
But there's a role, but they are weaker than the elites, and so it's a tricky one, and so yeah.
And very often behind these revolutions, you see the role played by the elite. So you take this sort of series of revolutions, quote unquote, in the early 2000s in Kyrgyzstan or in Ukraine or in a number of other revolutions. I'm not speculating over any foreign interference or involvement. I'm just saying the elite is a part of the opposition's bargain and coalition as well. It would be naive to say it's just David versus Goliath, the elite versus the people, when frankly, in practice, it's elite fragmentation. Some in the elite are going with some in the people, and others in the elite are going with other portions of the people. But in any case, I do want to draw your attention to a slightly different set of case studies, what you term hyena states in your book. And I suppose they would include Afghanistan under the Taliban. And might I also add, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I would say that Myanmar under the current military junta, and also the prior or previous junta prior to Aung San Suu Kyi's brief period in positions of power. So in these countries, what do you see, Stefan, as the primary solutions or remedies to the developmental malaise there? And where do we start, basically? That's my sort of question. Is it a political fix they need? Is it a military fix they need? Is it an economic bargain? I mean, Afghanistan, Myanmar are, I believe, sort of the lowest on the HDI scale countries currently in the world. So where do we start with these countries?
Yeah, I know. And so like, Afghanistan, as people are predicting now that it will be the country with the highest number of extreme poor people on the World Bank definition by 2030, just beginning to compete even with the DRC and Nigeria, which will be the two others above them. And, for the size of that country, that's a dreadful situation. So I see them, of course, and it's very easy to look back at things saying, look, these are failures during earlier windows of opportunities. And I think that's the first thing to recognize is that you can't say today, oh, I'm going to now change Afghanistan, or I have a very simple route to change Myanmar now. Although Myanmar is an interesting one, I find Sudan also an interesting of this failed opportunity that when the street and let me both on Myanmar and Sudan and make a few comments. Afghanistan is just there's a whole series of other things that were happening there, but Myanmar and Sudan have the following similarities: that the legitimacy of the military regimes in both cases, under al-Bashir or under the military rule before Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, the legitimacy was being undermined. And in fact, from economic necessity almost, they had to actually begin to find another way of opening up. And in a sense, in both cases, you got military leaders under pressure being put aside and more reformist leaders coming up, or at least recognizing in Myanmar case that they had to start doing something else. Okay? And so getting a process. Now, these are the amazing windows of opportunities. And I would actually argue that the international community wasted them. And it's actually in the following sense. So if you think of what happened in Myanmar, you have to recognize there's so much similarity between Myanmar and Sudan in that sense, and even the Sudan of today. The military control easily, is it 30 or 60% of the economy? I can't say. It's a bit nebulous by proxies, but they control a really big part of the economy. So you have a window where some political changes happen possible. So in Sudan, it was al-Bashir gets out of the way, military is willing not necessarily to let the street rule the country, but the suits, as we could call them, an old bureaucratic elite was brought back in, and the suits were in charge, Hamdok and so on. Decent people, an old, very much an old bureaucratic urban elite was allowed to run the country. Everybody else is saying, oh, this is great, let's now just make this country do state building, get it all built up, and so on and so on and so on. But actually, there was no new elite deal. It was just that the existing political deal got weaker. But this is not an elite bargain that takes into account the economic processes. And it's very striking that the moment the military interests in the economy were beginning to be under threat, they stepped back in. In Myanmar, they kept on all kinds of things, and then they start to go, we now need to start attacking the cronies and so on. No, at some point, no, that's the basis of the power of the military, is the economic interest. So they didn't manage to do the kind of unholy deal with the economic interest. In Sudan, similarly, we're always talking about all kinds of things, and slowly say, of course, we're going to get the market economy getting out. And in fact, the military was very smart. They waited until debt relief was pushed through. The HIPIC thing was ready. Multilateral financing started flowing. So there's a little bit better thing. Okay, we come back in. And if you think even the breakdown in Sudan is entirely because the RPF, the militia, started threatening they began to control more and more of the economic assets of the regular army. And in fact, if you look at it, some wonderful papers of that actually the RPF, I think, is controlling now 35% of the economic assets. And it's actually, that's what it's focusing on, capturing this in Darfur and all the kind, and the oil and so on. And once they start capturing, that's actually what the civil war is now. It's within the military forces. So the long and the short is that you have these windows opportunities in some of these predatory states, but you have to recognize that if we start from predation, you can't just simply say, oh, well, you're usually not powerful enough to kick the predatory forces immediately out of it. It will take some time. And in Myanmar and in Sudan, we should have recognized that actually a transition to a slightly more inclusive, better functioning state would have been some form of accommodation at first. In Myanmar, of the cronies and the military in the economic space. And in Sudan, similarly, recognizing that they control the economy. I remember having to do a briefing of the United Nations Secretary General and his team. And I kind of said in general, these windows of opportunities, the deals you get out of it, they won't look like the SDGs, they will can look quite ugly. Coming out of conflict, coming out of breakdown, coming out of predation. It will not all suddenly turn into the perfect state. And we just recognize that the ugly deals need to be made as well.
And speaking of ugly deals, I am going to sort of turn your attention to, I guess, a hard case in my view, which is the 90s in post-Soviet Russia. Now, back then, Boris Yeltsin appeared to have formed a bargain with a very small and select circle of oligarchs. They're the ones who benefited from immense arbitrage, morally dubious privatization, and dare I say, some deeply unconducive rent-seeking using newly gained access and monopoly rights in the early 1990s. And then, of course, since the early 2000s onwards, we've seen the rise of the sort of Silovic, the security come intelligence complex, basically folks have reached their own unholy deals with the now oil revenue enriched state of Russia in the early 2000s. How would you have advised Yeltsin and perhaps specifically Yegor Gaidar differently? Do you think that the shock therapy championed by folks like Jeff Sachs, for instance, back then has failed the Russian people? And if you were there, what would you have said instead to Yeltsin and Gaidar?
Well, I would have definitely said don't listen to Jeff Sachs, but that's a general rule in my life, not in a specific one. I mean, the problem is that it's an interesting thing about the kind of, what in fact the kind of dominant view had become, a kind of, it was a very strange form of a global elite bargain that emerged initially, towards the end of the Cold War, a kind of united view, we can do Fukuyama's end of history, and this kind of very naive, simplistic way of implementing it. You don't recognize that economic structures and institutions, you better let them emerge slowly rather than with big bang, or you get the kind of outcome. So I would have advised is actually saying, look, I would almost have probably advised and saying, try to study, say, even like a Margaret Thatcher. Now, why would I say Margaret Thatcher? It took her 10 years to slowly move, okay, within her ideology, whether I liked it or not at the time, but to actually get a real structural change in that society. I would actually say, look, look at India. They do a massive budget speech in 1991 that they're going to change the economy to much less of a controlled Nehruvian economy to a more liberalized economy. But if you look in practice how long it took them to actually do it, they did a few things like, trade liberalization early on, but they were slower in doing this. And this is actually probably the big lesson, is that because there are unexpected consequences when you do it. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have tried to have a roadmap to actually get to the kind of divesting from the state controlling everything to a market economy. We've seen in Eastern Europe that actually can be quite successful. Poland is a case of amazing success, an amazing successful transition. But there it was much more in a kind of a protected environment with Germany playing a very positive role and so on. The big bang of Mr. Sachs and Andrew Schleifer and people like that is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. And it's basically the failure of economists never to study what happens in disequilibrium. It's a funny thing. You go from one equilibrium to the other one, and we actually have not that much to say how you go from one equilibrium to the other one. Now, of course, the key part of structural reform is that you need to find in a world of multiple equilibria, you need to go from one equilibrium to another one. And you can't simply jump from one to another because there's a trajectory. And in fact, it comes very closely to what I'm spending a lot of my time on is I'm trying to help some governments to actually think through how do I do structural reforms in the economy. If I take a country like Pakistan, it clearly should do what India did in 1991. It's actually remarkably similar of the nature of the crisis that India had in 1991. But you also say, look, learn from India and also learn about the speed. So don't try to be too crazy. And the main thing is that I experience already working in that country is that the problem is not the structural reforms and what you need to do. The problem is really, is there a political path towards it without getting the wrong forces to capture everything? And that's a standard thing. So yeah, Russia, it's a textbook example of economists forgetting about politics and who will get access to all these resources.
And speaking of forgetting about politics and also what you said about moving from one equilibrium to another, I want to turn your attention now to something we were chatting about just then before we started this podcast officially, the global developmental bargain. And you were talking about essentially how, perhaps between the mid-90s and late 90s or so, all the way through up until 2015, there was always this golden 20 years in global developmental trajectory and history where countries almost all unanimously agreed, at least across vast swaths of the global north and the south, to pack aside geopolitical, ideological differences and focus on development. Now, of course, there's counterterrorism, there's concerns to do with insurgency groups, and of course, the looming question of Eastern Europe and Georgia and Crimea never went away in the intervening years. But by and large, I'm inclined to agree with you, Stefan, of course, that there was this global development bargain. But to what extent do you think this has been negated, undone, and has unwinded at this moment of our conversation? And do you think it's salvageable, this global bargain, or are we entering into a period where geopolitical balkanization and the digging in of heels over aligned systems is once again creeping back into the global stage? What do you make of this?
No, look here. It's something I'm trying to think a bit more about it at this stage, and it's helpful to actually make sure that what was actually the deal in the 1980s and what it looked like, and in a sense, the Russia case is actually taking the inspiration still very much of the 1980s thinking, which was this kind of fairly naive, emphasis on sometimes of form over content, of geopolitics determining everything that we would be doing, and having these simplistic narratives. Okay, so in the 1980s, it's kind of interesting. What was definitely, of course, there was still full of Cold War, so there was none of that thinking going on. And so any kind of engagement with the global South, especially poorer countries, whether it's in South Asia or Southeast Asia or in Latin America or in Africa, was very much inspired in the West of, it's all about geopolitics here. And secondly, we're going to do fairly, simplistic narratives, just move to market reform, be ours, and so on. And everything became in a very naive, what in the end Jeff Sachs then promoted in Eastern Europe and in Russia. The 90s are very interesting because it's the end of the Cold War. So you actually come to some, at least in development cooperation, in some form of unipolarity in most of these spaces. There is actually a unipolarity. It's actually a funny thing. It's probably one of the few spaces where the end of history was true, where actually you could operate. And of course, the other part of it is that what you alluded to is globalization, but also some kind of, less concern about what sometimes people call process legitimacy, autocracy versus democracy or whatever, but actually more outcome. As long as it's performing somewhere, we can work with you. You end up being able to, with the Meles Zenawi, you're able to work with the Kagames, even though they're autocratic regimes and so on. So, and that's, I think, it's the kind of remarkable thing that the global development bargain gave us, because it was uncontested politically amongst a lot of the richer countries that were in the business of aid. It was actually surrounded by globalization that say, look, and of course China plays a big role, but a lot of other countries as well, that you say, look, it's a win-win, it's a win-win for everybody. And then finally, this real willingness to say, look, we can look a bit at results rather than than having to look at are they in our camp or not? You can look at the thing. I think underlying it, we shouldn't forget, I call it a global development bargain, because it was a remarkable combination of players that had a bargain together, and we could talk, political players, but, from South and from North, China and the West, we could play that. That was the thing. Business loved it on all sides. The business community, the business elite, but interestingly, civil society and intellectuals that are interested in development, well, we liked as well. We could do an awful lot of things. MDGs could be there. We could do SDG language. You could build up. So there's a kind of remarkable coalition between not normal bedfellows. And I would say that was the condition that delivered a lot of development success. I mean, the Asian development successes are partly delivered by that benign global environment. Similarly, Ethiopia or Ghana couldn't have done as well if that had not been present. And it's a strange golden age. I was working in the aid industry towards the end of it. Yeah, it was remarkably easy. But where are we now? And that's, of course, your question. Is that, of course, that politically that deal broke down. You were dating it in 2016. I'm actually thinking, if I look at, and of course, we're thinking of certain presidencies and the like coming in. But it's very interesting if you look at the State Department in the US. They clearly were prepared, because it was quite a dramatic shock. And we also know that Trump leaves the White House and it doesn't change. This is actually more forces within in the elite that actually there. But also we shouldn't forget another part of it. Part of the deal broke down in the West also, because it's a very strange thing. We never managed to explain globalization, that it really helps you as consumers, but not necessarily for you as workers in the Western countries. It's a funny thing, it's the same people. The iPhone is as cheap as it is thanks to globalization. iPhone is expensive. A mobile phone is as cheap as it is because of globalization. But at the same time, the workers, the lower middle class and so on, couldn't do it. You see it in Europe. So it's this kind of that is the political part broke down in a more deeper thing. It's not one person, it's not the political players, but people could do it. And of course, for certain businesses as well, for certain businesses, it wasn't working that well. People that were much more working on domestic markets and so on, it broke down, and that goes in all the way into Africa. Vested interest, it broke down for them. You couldn't deal with the competition. And so politically, it breaks down in a lot of places. And of course, then multipolarity comes into it, just the reality of present age. But an inability for Western countries to allow multi-alignment, where actually developing countries, the global south has a choice. As far as I'm concerned, they should take the choice. Whether it's China, whether it's the West, whether it's the Gulf, just it's in their interest to make the choices. But actually, the geopolitics comes then back and tries to actually force these things. So where are we with this? Of course, and maybe the final point is, then you get the European Union suddenly talking about our values in a strong way. But the problem is, we have to have a conversation on democracy. We have to really make a distinction between form over content. And you get back to, it's not anymore whether Abiy delivers or not. As long as he holds elections, it's fine. And we get back to, it's nothing to do with, do they actually deliver in development for populations or not? So where do we go? We clearly need to find, and there's the only way definitely for the developing countries, I look at it, for African countries, some South Asian, to actually keep this progress going, we'll need to go back to a form of globalization versus 2.0. We need to find a way of rediscovering that, because it really won't play. We need to find a way of allowing multi-alignment to be consistent with that globalization, if I may put it like this. And we want to make sure that, we look at outcomes, not at processes only. And we want to see whether we can. And so I think global development is in crisis because we can't find somehow a narrative in it. And I'll let you come back in and some other thoughts that I could add to that.
I want to chime in here and just add two observations. The first is the Kindleberger trap. My worry and fear is that as the strategic rivalry between China and the US intensifies, there's less inclination between the two governments and countries to engage in cooperation and collaboration. But on the plus side, and this is where I sort of put on my optimist hat, I do think that to some extent the shift towards greater multi-alignment, the rise of middle powers, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, and of course India's sort of wavering between a middle and indeed a regional power with outsized global soft power and increasing economic heft. Between all of these, what I'm seeing is that multi-alignment and the choices made by leaders of these countries is in fact enabling them to have the best of both worlds. In the case of Malaysia, for instance, on one hand, it's engaging Chinese companies. There's talk of 5G. Anwar Ibrahim, has been very effusive and embracive towards a Chinese investment for the East Coast Railway, for a lot of developmental initiatives, and even is petitioning to join BRICS. On the other hand, Tesla is setting up, its operations in Malaysia, and there's talk of course, very controversial at the moment, bringing in BlackRock to help run the airport in Malaysia. And in fact, that was the talk of town when I was there just this past week. So it's not all, the glass is half empty, but it's also half full. And a second observation I have on this is perhaps globalization isn't ending for all countries, but it certainly is emerging in an increasingly splintered form, one where ideological and geopolitical battle lines are not just being drawn, but also are seeping into and creeping into economic lines. All this talk of reshoring, friendshoring, the Belt and Road Initiative, vis-a-vis the Build Back Better, the BBB initiative, which I'm unclear, given the present state of American politics, if it's going to go anywhere, or the IPEF, and you name it. All of these initiatives are economic and pro-development and pro-trade, and yet they seem to have a very overt political undertone to them. So with that in mind, I must say I'm not particularly optimistic about the sort of disentangling of politics from development. But I suppose, what you could say is that it's really just revealing a truth that's always been there, that politics has never left, but it's merely that it was, shelved to one side for 20 years, and now it's making a re-entry, especially on an international level. I do want to move on to, in the interest of time, the final question for you, Stefan, and that is a more personal question. Your career has taken you to the highest echelons of public service and governmental advisory services and the deepest reaches of academia. You're researching, writing, and engaging in thought leadership in, of course, one of the best institutions in the world on development economics, if not in general, on all research. What keeps you going? What drives you? And what's next for you? What's your next research project and book in a pipeline that our audience could have the fortune of getting a glimpse into, if at all?
Well, what keeps me going is that, it's basically finding that sweet spot between being very engaged on the policy side, as well as and as well as in the academia. I've been in academia. I understand the academic world very well. I think one of the things I'm less necessarily inspired by is to write the next academic paper to go into a top journal. I actually feel very much my role there somewhere being in the middle between academia, but then also on the policy advice. But the advantage, of course, I have, and you allude to it, I've been inside it. And I think, deep down, I probably could have been not an economist, maybe an anthropologist. I just love the participant observation part of being inside the room where decisions are being made, the politics that is actually happening, the raw politics, not the theoretical politics, but the raw politics of all that stuff. So what I'm doing a lot at the moment is actually offering pro bono my services to actually developing country governments in Africa and South Asia, and do the best that I can is to actually help them with advice, of course, how do you deal with trying to do sensible economic things, but in a political environment. And I think that's such a thing that both the political side, so the problem with sometimes with the political advisors, they can advise you all kinds of things on the political side, but actually they don't understand economics. The economists, of course, don't understand politics. And I feel like I have something there, having been in the midst of these things, to actually helping to maneuver this ability to give good political advice, but that's politically, good economic advice, but in a politically informed way. And I think that's where, at the moment, I think I'm in a phase again where I'm doing an awful lot of things in practice in a whole series of countries. And we're setting up a small group providing the backroom support for that. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do this pro bono. No one needs to contract. They can throw you out whenever you want. So you can say what you want. They can just throw you out whenever you want to. I'm pretty sure there's a book in there with a lot of experience, because as people observe on anyone who hangs out in Argentina or in Kenya, it can get very raw. And just getting WhatsApp messages sent from a prime minister in a country saying, yes, I know I should do all these reforms, but how do I avoid the fate of Milei or Ruto is a really good question to ask me as the economic advisor. And so I find that great fun. So there's a lot. And look, it's difficult times in a lot of countries. So for me, the worry about, are we back in the 1980s? Is real there, and can I point to one thing? If I may, it's really important. If we go back to in the 1980s, I was alluding to that. There was geopolitics, there was a lot of talk about values and form over content and all the stuff. But also we were telling these narratives that were not adapted to realities, and we alluded to Jeff Sachs. And I think that's the key thing. We simplified economics in that, just do this and everything will follow. I worry a lot, as seen from poorer countries, that we do the same with climate dialogues. We ask them, don't worry, you just go for a low carbon economy. Nobody's ever done that. Are we really asking some of the poorest countries to take these risks? We have these simple narratives as if it's obvious that a low carbon economy is going to be straightforward. It's richer places should try it out. And then maybe some of the poorest ones could try it. Meanwhile, we're telling them, you just have to build climate resilience and adaptation and all this stuff because climate change is real. Of course, climate change is real. But do we realize what we tell them? This is what actually one of my research areas. De-risking something typically means lower returns. They need growth. They are in a massive growth and prosperity crisis in lower and lower middle income countries. So we're telling them against stories that are not adapted. So I still see myself also having a role towards opinion makers, making sure, realize what are the stories you tell to a poor developing country, to the finance minister there, to the president, to the prime minister. Try to think about what they sound like. And are you really recognizing how tricky some of these things will be? So that's what I see being in that interface and keep on helping maneuver the space. And of course, I have great fun. I'm, as an anthropologist, implicitly sitting there and observing. And gosh, I wish I could tell you all kinds of stories already, but I'm going to wait until these people are out of office. And then I think I'll write another book about these experiences of the last.
And I hope you'll tell me in advance over a pint. This kind of constructive empathy you exhibit, Stefan, is really quite inspirational, because there's so much of academia, and you and I are both in it, of course, that's really just about putting out ideas, abstracts, hypotheticals, postulates. But when it comes to doing the dirty work of making change happen on the ground, it's tough, and it's often grueling. It's unpleasant. It doesn't sit easily with our so-called conscience to be able to talk about getting into the weeds or figuring out this coalition. How do you preserve, enough of a stake and skin in the game in this deal for a military general? We don't want to hear that in very idealized narratives where we say, to the people and to the downfall and down with all those who are not the people. But in practice, that's a kind of complexity and also sophisticated maneuvering that's needed in a tricky, imperfect situations. And on that very note, thank you all very much for tuning in to this episode of our Democracy and Development series. And I hope you've enjoyed it, and stay tuned for our next